When people talk about the Vietnam War, they usually bring up the tunnels, the helicopters, and the guerrilla warfare. And although these were indeed defining features of the conflict, chemical weapons, on the other hand, deserve their own place in that discussion because nothing else from that war attacked not just soldiers, but entire ecosystems and future generations in such a methodical and long-lasting way. We are going to go deep on that. And because this is not quite a light topic, we are giving you a chance here to reconsider watching this video if you are looking to avoid some genuinely disturbing content about what modern warfare can do to human bodies and to the environment itself. Take this as a genuine warning before we go any further, so if you're still here, let us start all the way from why there was a perceived need for such weapons in a war that was already brutal enough without them. First of all, the Vietnam War presented unique challenges that conventional weapons struggled to address. The dense jungle canopy that covered much of South Vietnam and the border regions provided perfect concealment for Viet Cong forces who could disappear into the vegetation within seconds of making contact with American or South Vietnamese troops. Traditional tactics of finding and fixing the enemy simply did not work when the enemy could hide in triple canopy jungle so thick that aerial observation was nearly impossible and ground patrols could pass within meters of enemy positions without detecting them. American military planners looked at this problem and decided that if they could not see the enemy through the jungle, they would simply remove the jungle itself. And if Viet Cong forces were receiving support from rural populations who grew food in areas the government could not control, then they would destroy those crops and force the population to relocate. This thinking led to the most extensive use of chemical weapons since World War I, but with a crucial difference. In the Great War, chemicals were used directly as weapons to kill and injure enemy soldiers. In Vietnam, the official purpose was different. These were herbicides and defoliants, chemicals designed to kill plants rather than people. The fact that these chemicals would prove devastating to human health was either not fully understood at the time or was considered an acceptable cost of military necessity. The American military chemical warfare program in Vietnam operated under the codename Operation Ranch Hand, and it ran from 1961 through 1971, spraying approximately 19 million gallons of various herbicide mixtures over roughly 4.5 million acres of Vietnamese land. The C-123 provider aircraft that conducted these missions flew low and slow over the jungle canopy while releasing their chemical payloads from tanks and spray bars, and the crews who flew these missions adopted the motto "Only you can prevent" forests as a dark joke about their mission to defoliate the Vietnamese countryside. They had no idea what they were doing to themselves, let alone to the people living below. Now, before we get into the specific effects and the truly disturbing long-term consequences that are still affecting people today, let us first understand what these chemicals actually were and how they worked. The most infamous of all the herbicides used in Vietnam was Agent Orange, named not for its colour but for the orange stripe painted on the 55-gallon drums it was shipped in. Agent Orange was actually a 50-50 mixture of two herbicides, 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T. When mixed together and sprayed over vegetation, these chemicals acted as synthetic growth hormones that caused plants to grow uncontrollably until they literally exhausted themselves and died, with leaves dropping and plants withering within days of exposure. But here is where it gets truly horrifying. The manufacturing process for 2,4,5-T inevitably created a contaminant, a byproduct that was not intended to be in the final product, but that was essentially impossible to remove with the industrial processes being used at the time. That contaminant was TCDD, which is the most toxic form of dioxin known to science. And the Agent Orange used in Vietnam was contaminated with TCDD at levels far higher than would be tolerated in any agricultural herbicide, because the military contracts prioritized cheap mass production over purity, and the manufacturers were not particularly careful about controlling contamination levels when producing chemicals for military use rather than for commercial sale. Now, just pause for a moment and think about what this means. 19 million gallons of herbicide contaminated with one of the most toxic substances ever created, being sprayed over millions of acres where people live and farm and raise their children. Let that sink in before we continue. The spray missions themselves were conducted with remarkable efficiency and terrible disregard for civilian exposure. The C-123 aircraft flew at altitudes of just 150 feet, low enough that the spray would settle on the target vegetation rather than dispersing into the atmosphere, and they released approximately 3 gallons per acre during each pass, which is roughly 13 times the amount that would be used for similar herbicides in agricultural applications in the United States. Along rivers and canals where vegetation was particularly dense, aircraft sometimes made multiple passes, increasing the concentration to levels that killed not just leaves, but entire root systems while leaving the water contaminated for extended periods. The pilots and crew members flying these missions were repeatedly exposed to the chemicals through skin contact and inhalation, because the spray drifted into the cockpit and because they often got covered in the stuff during loading and maintenance operations, and they were told by their superiors that the herbicides were harmless to humans and that there was no need for protective equipment beyond standard flight gear. This claim would prove to be one of the most deadly lies told during the entire war. But the spray operations were not limited to remote jungle areas where only Viet Cong operated. The chemicals were sprayed along roads and waterways to clear vegetation that might conceal ambushes, around the perimeters of military bases to create clear fields of fire, and over agricultural land in areas suspected of providing food to Viet Cong forces. This meant that countless South Vietnamese civilians, the people that American forces were theoretically in Vietnam to protect, were directly exposed to massive doses of contaminated herbicides that would affect their health for the rest of their lives and the health of their children and grandchildren through mechanisms that would only become clear years later. Agent Orange was not the only chemical agent used in Vietnam, though it was by far the most common, accounting for roughly 65% of the total herbicides sprayed. Agent White and Agent Blue were also used extensively, with Agent Blue being specifically designed to kill rice and other food crops. Think about that for a moment. A weapon designed specifically to destroy the food supply of a civilian population. The military rationale was that denying food to the Viet Cong would weaken their ability to operate. But the reality was that destroying rice paddies primarily harmed civilian farmers and their families, while the Viet Cong simply obtained their food through other means, including increased taxation of the population and supply lines from North Vietnam. Now we need to discuss what these chemicals actually did to human beings, and this is where the content becomes genuinely disturbing. The immediate effects of exposure to the herbicides were often relatively mild, which created a false sense of security that these chemicals were indeed harmless to humans as the military claimed. People who were sprayed directly might experience skin irritation or nausea or headaches, but these symptoms typically resolved within days, leading both military personnel and Vietnamese civilians to believe that exposure was not a serious health concern. The truly horrific effects would only become apparent years and decades later. TCDD, the dioxin contaminant in Agent Orange, is what is known as a persistent organic pollutant, meaning it does not break down readily in the environment and it accumulates in fatty tissue rather than being metabolized and eliminated from the body. When someone is exposed to TCDD through skin contact or inhalation, or ingestion of contaminated food or water, the dioxin enters their body and essentially never leaves. It concentrates in fatty tissues, including the liver and the brain and the reproductive organs, and it remains there for decades with a half-life in the human body measured in years rather than days or weeks. The mechanism by which TCDD causes harm is insidious and operates at the cellular level. Dioxin molecules bind to receptors inside cells that normally regulate gene expression, essentially hijacking the cellular machinery that controls which genes are turned on and off. This disruption affects cellular development and function in ways that are still not fully understood even today, but the results are devastatingly clear. TCDD is a confirmed human carcinogen, meaning it causes cancer through direct damage to cellular DNA and through disruption of normal cellular growth regulation. And it is also a teratogen, meaning it causes birth defects by disrupting normal fetal development in the womb. The Vietnamese people who lived in heavily sprayed areas began experiencing unusual health problems within years of the spray operations. Cancer rates increased dramatically, particularly for soft tissue sarcomas and liver cancers and lymphomas that are specifically associated with dioxin exposure. But the truly heartbreaking effects became apparent when children began being born with severe birth defects at rates far higher than normal. We are talking about conditions so severe that if we described them in detail here, this video would certainly be taken down. But you need to understand that we are discussing birth defects that are incompatible with life, or that leave children requiring total care for their entire existence. and these cases appeared in numbers that clearly indicated something terrible was affecting the population. The Vietnamese doctors who first noticed the pattern of birth defects in areas that had been heavily sprayed tried to alert international medical authorities, but their warnings were largely dismissed or ignored because admitting the connection would mean acknowledging that American military operations had created a health catastrophe affecting millions of people. It was not until American veterans who had served in Vietnam began reporting similar health problems, including cancers and birth defects in their own children, that serious research into the effects of Agent Orange exposure began, and even then the official response was slow and defensive, with both the military and the chemical manufacturers denying any connection between herbicide exposure and health problems. Let me give you some specific numbers to understand the scale of this disaster. The Vietnamese government estimates that approximately 4.8 million Vietnamese people were exposed to herbicides during the war, and of these, approximately 3 million are suffering from health problems that they attribute to that exposure. The Vietnam Red Cross estimates that up to 1 million Vietnamese have disabilities or health problems linked to Agent Orange, including approximately 150,000 children born with severe birth defects. And, because dioxin can be passed from mother to child through the placenta and through breast milk, we are now seeing third-generation effects with grandchildren of people exposed during the war being born with health problems, meaning this chemical weapon is still harming people today, more than 50 years after the spray operations ended. For American veterans, the situation is similarly grim, though the exposure levels were generally lower than those experienced by Vietnamese civilians living in heavily sprayed areas. The Department of Veterans Affairs now recognizes numerous conditions as being presumptively related to Agent Orange exposure, including multiple types of cancer and type 2 diabetes and Parkinson's disease and peripheral neuropathy and ischemic heart disease. Tens of thousands of American veterans have died from these conditions, and countless more live with chronic illness and disability that they attribute to their exposure to chemicals their own government told them were safe. But we are not done with the chemical weapons used in Vietnam, because Agent Orange, despite being the most famous and perhaps the most destructive in the long term, was not the only chemical employed. The American military also used massive quantities of CS gas, which is technically classified as a riot control agent, rather than a chemical weapon. But when used in the confined spaces of tunnel systems and bunkers, CS gas becomes far more than just a crowd control tool. The concentrations used in Vietnam were often high enough to cause severe respiratory distress, and in some cases death, particularly when victims could not escape the contaminated area quickly. CS gas works by irritating the mucous membranes of the eyes and nose and throat and lungs, causing intense burning pain and uncontrollable tearing and coughing that makes it impossible to fight or even to see clearly. In the tunnel systems where Viet Cong fighters lived and operated, American forces would pump enormous quantities of CS gas into the tunnels, hoping to force the occupants to flee to the surface where they could be captured or killed. The people hiding in these tunnels, which often included women and children and elderly civilians in addition to fighters, would experience the full effects of CS exposure in concentrated form with no way to escape because the gas was being pumped in continuously. The long-term effects of CS exposure are less severe than those of dioxin contamination, but people who are repeatedly exposed report chronic respiratory problems and skin conditions and eye damage that persist decades after exposure. And because CS was used in such massive quantities, with grenades and bulk dispersion and aerial spray, countless Vietnamese civilians were exposed whether they had any connection to the Viet Cong or not. Then we have white phosphorus, which is technically classified as an incendiary weapon rather than a chemical weapon, but its effects on the human body are chemical in nature and absolutely horrific. White phosphorus ignites spontaneously when exposed to oxygen and burns at extremely high temperatures while producing thick white smoke, and it was used extensively in Vietnam for marking targets and for creating smoke screens, and as a direct weapon against enemy positions. When white phosphorus particles land on skin, they continue burning until they are either completely consumed or until oxygen is excluded from the burning material, and the burning phosphorus creates severe thermal and chemical burns that penetrate deep into tissue. The chemical burns from white phosphorus are particularly terrible because the phosphorus continues reacting with tissue as it burns, creating phosphoric acid that causes additional chemical damage beyond the thermal injury. Victims describe the pain as unbearable, and the wounds are extremely difficult to treat, because any phosphorus particles remaining in the tissue will reignite when exposed to air during medical treatment. The long-term effects include severe scarring and disability and chronic pain, and many victims of white phosphorus burns in Vietnam still bear the scars today, both physical and psychological. We should also mention napalm here, even though it is technically an incendiary weapon rather than a chemical weapon, because the distinction becomes meaningless when you understand what napalm does to human tissue. Napalm is jellied gasoline that sticks to whatever it touches and burns at temperatures high enough to melt metal, and it was used extensively throughout Vietnam in both aerial bombs and in flamethrowers. The burns created by napalm are among the most severe injuries possible, often destroying tissue down to the bone while creating wounds that are extremely prone to infection, and that heal, if they heal at all, with severe scarring and contractures that can permanently disable victims. The famous photograph of Phan Thi Kim Phuoc, the 9-year-old girl running naked down a road after being burned by napalm in 1972, became one of the most iconic images of the war and helped turn American public opinion against the conflict. But what the photograph cannot convey is the years of painful treatment and skin grafts and rehabilitation that followed, or the fact that she still suffers pain from her scars today, 50 years after that napalm strike. And she is one of the lucky ones because she survived and received treatment. Countless others, particularly in remote villages, died from their burns or from subsequent infections, or survived with disabilities that destroyed their ability to work or to live independently. Now, we need to talk about the environmental damage because the chemical warfare program in Vietnam did not just harm people, it destroyed ecosystems that had existed for thousands of years and that still have not fully recovered. The mangrove forests along the coast were particularly vulnerable to herbicide spraying because mangroves are extremely sensitive to chemical disturbance, and vast areas of mangrove forest that provided crucial habitat for fish and birds and supported coastal fishing communities were completely destroyed and have never regenerated. Approximately 36% of the mangrove forests in South Vietnam were sprayed, and in many areas the forest died completely and was replaced by degraded scrubland or simply by mud flats that cannot support the complex ecosystems that existed before. The inland forest suffered similarly, with vast areas of triple canopy jungle being reduced to grassland and secondary growth that lacks the biodiversity and ecological functions of the original forest. The dioxin contamination persists in the soil in heavily sprayed areas, and the concentrations in some locations remain high enough to be dangerous today, meaning that the land cannot be safely used for agriculture or habitation. The Vietnamese government has identified numerous dioxin hotspots, primarily around former American air bases where herbicides were stored and loaded onto aircraft, and where spills and improper disposal created areas of extreme contamination that will require decades and enormous expense to remediate if remediation is even possible. The wildlife suffered catastrophically as well, with populations of larger mammals declining sharply in sprayed areas and with entire species being pushed toward extinction. The forests that were destroyed provided habitat for tigers and elephants, and numerous primate species and countless bird species, and the loss of this habitat combined with the direct toxic effects of the chemicals on wildlife created ecological damage that persists today. Some bird species that were common before the war are now rare or locally extinct in areas that were heavily sprayed. Let us talk about the American response to the health crisis created by Agent Orange exposure, because this is a story of denial and delay and legal battles that continues to this day. When veterans began reporting health problems in the 1970s and 80s, the Department of Defense and the Department of Veterans Affairs initially denied any connection to herbicide exposure and refused to provide treatment or disability compensation. The chemical manufacturers, including Monsanto and Dow Chemical, also denied that their products caused harm and fought aggressively against any claims or lawsuits. It took years of veterans organising and lobbying and scientific research, demonstrating clear connections between dioxin exposure and various health conditions before the government finally began acknowledging the problem and providing benefits to affected veterans. The Vietnamese victims have received far less attention and essentially no compensation. While American veterans can receive disability benefits and healthcare through the VA system if they can prove service in Vietnam and if their conditions are on the list of presumptive conditions related to Agent Orange, Vietnamese civilians who are directly exposed to far higher concentrations of herbicides have no such recourse. The Vietnamese government has sought compensation from the United States government and from the chemical manufacturers, but these efforts have been unsuccessful, with American courts ruling that the herbicide spraying was not a war crime under international law, and that the manufacturers cannot be held liable for following government contracts. This creates a terrible injustice, where American service members who were occupationally exposed to Agent Orange receive benefits and recognition, while Vietnamese civilians who were intentionally sprayed or who lived in contaminated areas receive nothing. The United States government has provided some funding for environmental remediation of dioxin hotspots in Vietnam and for healthcare programs, but the amounts are tiny compared to the scale of the damage and compared to what is provided to American veterans. The scientific community has studied the effects of dioxin exposure extensively in the decades since the Vietnam War, and the findings confirm the worst fears about the long-term health consequences. The Institute of Medicine, now called the National Academy of Medicine, has conducted multiple comprehensive reviews of the scientific literature and has concluded that there is sufficient evidence of association between herbicide exposure and numerous cancers and other serious health conditions. The World Health Organization classifies TCDD as a known human carcinogen based on extensive evidence from occupational studies and from studies of exposed populations, including Vietnam veterans and Vietnamese civilians. But here is something particularly disturbing that we need to address. The effects of dioxin exposure can be passed to subsequent generations through epigenetic mechanisms, meaning that the chemical exposure experienced by one generation can affect the health of their children and grandchildren, even if those descendants were never directly exposed to the chemicals themselves. The dioxin damages not just the DNA itself, but also the chemical modifications that control how genes are expressed, and these modifications can be inherited, creating multi-generational health effects that extend far beyond the individuals who were originally exposed. This means that we are now seeing third-generation effects in Vietnam, with grandchildren of people exposed during the war being born with birth defects and health problems, and this pattern is likely to continue for additional generations into the future. The full extent of the damage created by the chemical warfare program in Vietnam may not be known for decades more, and the human cost continues accumulating every year as more affected children are born and as aging veterans and Vietnamese survivors develop cancers and other conditions related to their exposure decades ago. Over the course of the war, the American military sprayed approximately 19 million gallons of herbicides containing roughly 400 pounds of TCDD dioxin across South Vietnam, creating what the Vietnamese call the Agent Orange disaster that continues affecting millions of people today. The soil in heavily sprayed areas will remain contaminated for generations because dioxin does not readily break down in the environment. Some estimates suggest that the half-life of TCDD in tropical soil is between 100 and 200 years, meaning that dangerous levels of contamination will persist well into the 22nd century in the worst affected areas. The Vietnamese government estimates that approximately 28 million acres of forest and cropland were destroyed by herbicides, and approximately 12 million acres were sprayed more than once, creating areas of intense contamination. The ecological damage is essentially permanent because the complex forest ecosystems that existed before the war cannot simply regrow even after the chemical contamination fades, and much of the land has been permanently converted to degraded scrubland or agricultural land of marginal quality. Unlike the munitions from World War I that we mentioned earlier, which can be located and cleared even if the process is slow and dangerous, dioxin contamination is invisible and persistent and extremely difficult to remediate. The heavily contaminated hotspots around former military bases can theoretically be cleaned through soil excavation and high-temperature incineration, but this process is enormously expensive, costing tens of millions of dollars per site, and there are dozens of these sites requiring remediation. The low-level contamination spread across millions of acres of agricultural land and forest cannot be remediated at all with current technology, and people living in these areas simply have to accept living with contaminated soil and water. Vietnamese farmers still report finding birth defects in livestock at elevated rates in heavily sprayed areas, and people continue to accumulate dioxin in their bodies through consuming fish from contaminated water and through vegetables grown in contaminated soil. The food chain bioaccumulation means that even low levels of dioxin in the environment become concentrated as they move up the food chain, with fish and poultry, and humans showing much higher dioxin levels than the soil or water they obtained their food from, creating health risks that persist generations after the original spraying. The psychological impact on affected families in Vietnam is profound and ongoing because parents watch their children suffer from severe disabilities knowing that the cause was a deliberate military operation conducted decades before their children were born, and there is nothing they can do to help because the damage is already done at the genetic and cellular level before birth. The social stigma associated with families affected by Agent Orange makes the situation even worse, because in Vietnamese society, people sometimes avoid marrying into families with Agent Orange history due to fears that any children will be affected, creating isolation and discrimination on top of the medical and financial burdens these families already face. In recent years, some progress has been made in addressing the Agent Orange legacy. The United States and Vietnam have cooperated on environmental remediation projects at the most contaminated sites, including a major cleanup of dioxin contamination at Da Nang Airport that was completed in 2018 after years of work and significant American funding. Healthcare. Programs have been established to provide services to Vietnamese victims of Agent Orange, though the scale of these programs remains inadequate compared to the number of people affected. Scientific cooperation between American and Vietnamese researchers has improved understanding of the health effects and has helped validate the claims of Vietnamese victims whose suffering was long dismissed or ignored. But the fundamental injustice remains because the Vietnamese victims who suffered the most severe exposure and who continue suffering the consequences receive essentially no compensation, while American veterans with generally lower exposure levels receive benefits and recognition. The chemical manufacturers that produced Agent Orange, while knowing or having reason to know about the dioxin contamination, have never been held accountable for the damage their products created. And the United States government that ordered the use of these chemicals in quantities and concentrations far beyond what would be tolerated in domestic use has never formally apologized or provided adequate compensation to the millions of Vietnamese victims. It is really fascinating in the most disturbing sense how we can develop weapons that continue killing and maiming people generations after the conflict has ended, and how chemical contamination can transform entire landscapes into zones where the very soil and water remain poisonous for centuries. The chemical weapons used in Vietnam, particularly Agent Orange, represent a category of warfare that transcends the traditional boundaries of combat, because the victims include not just soldiers, but civilians and children who were not yet born when the weapons were used, and people who will be born decades from now, but who will still carry the genetic and cellular damage in their bodies. What do you think about this? The fact that we developed and used chemicals that would contaminate an entire country for generations? And would you like us to maybe do a video on the long-term environmental damage from other conflicts, or perhaps on the ongoing efforts to clean up the Agent Orange contamination in Vietnam today?